welcome to this MEF webinar. For those of you who don't know me, my name is Iain McCallum. I'm an advisor and program director at MEF, the Mobile Ecosystem Forum. I'm delighted to host this this MEF webinar for the PD&I work group. What steps can companies take today to optimize their identity management? Thank you very much for joining. I'm joined in this endeavor this afternoon by my excellent colleagues from the working group who are MEF members. I'll do it in alphabetical order of company just to save any recriminations later on. So we'll start with Boku, and we have with us today Stuart Neal, who's Chief Business Officer of Boku. If you'd like to just say hello, Stuart.
Hi Ian, hi everybody. Pleasure to be here.
Thank you very much. And all the way from Pennsylvania in the US, we have Carl Kill, who's the CEO of Boloro. Hi, Carl.
Hi, Ian. Thank you. Nice to be here and great to speak with everyone.
Thanks, Carl. And from just down the road, not too far from me, we have Lee Suko's Market Development Director of xConnect. Hi, Lee.
Everyone, looking forward to our discussion.
Thanks, Lee. And although you can't see him, I'm being ably assisted in this endeavour by my good colleague Sam Hill, who will be making sure that things run smoothly, unless I manage to get them wrong. So thank you very much for joining us today. I'd just like to go through a few slides. The slides are going to be really minimal, because there's nothing more boring on webinars than huge amounts of slides, but just to take you through a bit of the discussion we're having today and to give us a bit of context. Just to give you a little bit of an idea of some of the working group activities that take place in personal data and identity. We have an upcoming white paper, which I've bravely put in brackets there, May 2020. It's taken a lot longer than I expected it to, because it's a huge amount of work, but very much focused on some of the issues that we're going to be talking about today, namely identity and authentication for digital businesses. We also have a subgroup forming to engage the UK regulators to try and optimize rules around data sharing, particularly on fraud. And here, I suppose in this instance, we're talking about ICO and the PECA regulation that have inadvertently caused some, how should we say, a slightly not avoided a level playing field, let's put it that way. Completely unintentional. You know, regulation is there to be optimized, and MEF will be lobbying on behalf of MEF members to try and make that happen. Similar to the events that I've talked about in RCS, we are looking at what MEF can do in terms of an identity and authentication event towards the end of the year. Obviously, there are other organisations, you know, doing this stuff, but MEF, we are very much focused on from a practical perspective. There are many organisations out there talking about future ecosystem and how the ecosystem will develop. MEF is very much focused on the pragmatic, the here, the now, and what can be done for MEF members, but also their business customers. Couple of other things: we cooperate with the identity teams at GSMA, FIDO, EMA, and also with OIX, who we're moving towards an MOU with. I sit on the review board for the UK Blueprint for a National Identity Authority for the UK. Okay, and next one, Sam. So just to give a bit of context, I suppose, in terms of what we're talking about today, identity and authentication. I worked for the GSMA for a number of years on the Mobile Connect development, and identity and authentication is a complex and diffuse ecosystem, to say the least. You know, it's not like there's one clear solution that's a winner. It's all relatively in flux at the moment. There's a lot to play for. but I think it's worth pointing out that so this statement, just a few statements here to give a bit of context to the discussion. You might agree, you might vehemently disagree, but it's our contention that the future development of the digital economy is predicated upon us being able to securely transact with one another. And that means that we authenticate transactions, and in some cases we wish to, we will require to assert our identity in the digital realm. MEF believes, as a policy, that secure, interoperable, and regulated identity authentication framework, is required to enable the digital economy to succeed into the future. The current model of what constitutes a fairer value exchange, is in question, and I think how that develops over the coming years must be a priority also for the industry in terms of the personal data sharing and how that actually fits into the identity and authentication process. Next, please, Sam. Statement: ecosystem complexity might arguably serve individual solution providers, but not the industry as a whole, and the industry must take stock and simplify. You may agree, you may not. Next one, please, Sam. Regulators. I've worked with regulators a lot over the last 10 or 15 years in this country and across Europe and in Russian Federation, places like that. I think it's fair to say, and that they would probably agree, hopefully agree, that they are unable to match the pace of the industry, the pace of change within the industry. And it really is down to MEF and others to actively engage with government bodies to make the frameworks work. I'm not going to talk about it too much, but my colleague, CEO Dario Betti, who I hope might be on this call, did a webinar a couple of weeks ago regarding the 2020 Consumer Trust Report. No big surprises there. User trust is down. The number of people willing to download an app is a concern, and there's a general downturn, a continued downturn in consumer trust. That's something that affects people's ability and willingness to transact in the digital space. Next, please, Sam. So let's get down to it. Today's discussion points. We're going to talk about what the problem is. I think it's important to define, what the problem is. I love the statement that I love to use is that username and password is broken. Well, if it's broken, I used it again this morning to buy a new office chair. So we need to understand as an industry what we're saying when we think that username and password is broken and why. What's the impact of that on business? And next, please, Sam. We're going to talk a little bit about identity and authentication, what the difference is and what the difference means. We're going to talk about what practical and pragmatic steps businesses can take today to optimize their identity and authentication processes. And finally, if we get time, it would be interesting to try and get a view from the panelists on what needs to happen in the future. How do we progress as an industry and as an ecosystem? That's fine. If we can come out the slide decks now and we can start that discussion, I think, Sam. That's all right. So let me reintroduce the panelists, Lee, Stuart, and Carl. So we've talked about this a little bit. I was thinking individual conversations over the past few months. If we can start with the first discussion point, gentlemen. What's the problem? Lee, you and I have had many discussions about this. Would you like to kick us off?
Yeah, absolutely. So not jumping directly into your provocative question about passwords being broken. One of the problems is people don't understand what identity is, and that's not surprising. It's, there's multiple facets to it. It might just be helpful to kind of frame what we mean by identity first. And I put it into kind of 3 buckets. The first is identity and access management. So in English, how do people get identified to systems, granted access to stuff, and how is their usage tracked? And then digital identity, if we think about the crucial aspects of us as individuals, what aspects are digitized that uniquely identify us and can be verified by a third party? And then lastly, privacy and trust, which is more about how personal characteristics of a large percentage of the population are shared across ecosystems and regulated by governments. So it's no surprising that the problem is we don't know what identity means, because that's super hard, super complex, and risk is a big part of that. So, you know, the wrong people will get access to stuff they shouldn't. People will find security laborious and avoid it. That is a problem.
Sure. Okay. Thanks, Lee. Carl, a view from across the pond.
Sure. Thanks, Ian. So for us at Boloro, we look at identity as who you are. And we look at authentication as, is this really you? So we think you could actually authenticate somebody without using their personal biometric data, their most sensitive information, which is truly what their identity is all about. To get back to your original question, you know, what's the problem? To us, the problem is reliance on the internet, something that was never built to be secure to begin with. So think about the world just a few months ago, before the COVID pandemic. We already had a world where everybody was looking at online banking, digital payments, e-commerce. The whole world was already going online. But now look at us. We're all stuck at home. We're all doing everything remotely. We're absolutely mandated to be online. But this internet that we're all forced to be on was never built to be a secure way to do transactions. So to us, we need to look at not only identity and authentication, but when we look at authentication, we think it should be entirely separate from the internet. We think there should be out-of-band authentication using a separate channel. So it's not only multi-factor, but multi-channel. That avoids the single point of failure, and that could put real security in consumers' hands, which is exactly, you know, looking at the MEF report, much of what you focused on in that report was consumer distrust. Consumers don't want their personal biometric data and other confidential information to be just shared, you know, in ways that are insecure. They want security in their own hands, and that's exactly where we think it should be.
Yeah. Stuart, just before I come on to you, and I suppose it probably behooves me to explain this username and password is broken thing. You know, national, as part of the white paper stuff I'm doing, so part of the research there, and I think we've all seen this stuff before, but this was a more recent report by the National Cyber Security, is it Council? I'm not sure it is, but those guys in the UK, and of, I think, 23 million people whose accounts, not necessarily bank accounts, but, you know, retail accounts, etc., were hacked during, I think, 2018. I can't remember what the percentage was, but it was something like 5 million people. 5 million of those 23 million still had the password 123456.
Yeah.
3 million still had the password 1234567889. So, you know, it's clear that we do have a problem. You know, you probably get a hard time getting them to admit it, but the fact that, you know, fraud is covered off in, you know, businesses' balance sheets, you know, as a line item is not a great place for us to be. So in that sort of context, Stuart, what's your personal take on this, or the Boku take, whichever you prefer to give us?
So I was just writing down your password there, Ian, for a second.
Damn it.
And I think you've sort of, in your explanation for me, hit the nail on the head, right? Which is what is it about username and password that has kind of created this problem, because in theory, there shouldn't be an issue. However, people who want to interact more online want to have a simple experience, and what that's created is the fact that you know, Mrs. Miggins at home on her laptop or on her mobile phone has the same password and login to everything, because they want it to be simple and easy for them to access the services that they wish to access. And so, you know, for me, the problem is this kind of ever increasing trend of people wanting to do more stuff, particularly with the kind of emergence of the mobile device. You know, people are spending hours a day interacting, and it might not be necessarily buying stuff, but it could be logging into their email, it could be social media or communications. They want it to be as simple and easy to access as possible, but they also want to feel like they're being looked after and they're secure. Then you get the huge contradiction, which is, well, actually, I don't want you sharing my data. I just want you to make me secure without having to put me at risk. And so you've got this kind of evolution of things that are kind of unusable, super secure services. I'm getting a terrible echo on this side, apologies.
Yeah. We're having
there's a bit of a gremlin.
I think you're back.
I think I'm back. Okay, good. So there's this classic kind of trade-off between security and convenience, which is the sort of, you know, widely held belief. And I think for me, the username password is the sort of super convenient if you use the same username and password. But if you go to complex passwords and usernames different for every service that you use, you end up then needing a separate tool to manage the whole thing. So, you know, I think therein lies the problem. You need to kind of address both ends of the access at the same time, particularly in the mobile ecosystem. So that's what needs to be solved for.
Okay, thank you. So moving on to the next point, what is the impact? And I suppose let me explain a little bit what I mean here. Probably less so from the, well, no, actually, let's look at it from the user and the business perspective. So from a user perspective, sometimes when I am setting up a new account, the digital, or, you know, we call it digital onboarding, you know, sometimes, depending on the browser that I'm using, depending on the website that I visit, sometimes the pre-population stuff works, sometimes it doesn't. More often than not, and it happened to me again yesterday, it didn't. So manually I had to fill in all this stuff. And that process is non-standard. So sometimes it works and sometimes it doesn't. Sometimes, and I can't remember the last time, but I'm sure that I've got to the end of that process or near the end of it, and I just thought, I cannot be bothered. You know, and we're talking about abandoned shopping carts, you know, which online retailers have known and talked about for an awfully long time. So, you know, that's not something new. But moving on to the impact of business, well, we're talking about the same thing, abandoned shopping carts, lost revenue. We're talking about having to be these, they've had to, they've been sort of presented with a de facto situation where they have to be the identity management expert as well. You know, they have repositories very often of large amounts of customer data. You know, there's a question around whether or not that's needed, but essentially this is taking them away from their core business. It's costing them a huge amount of money. It's you know, it's not a battle that anyone can ever really end or see ending, because, you know, just as security is beefed up and, you know, people find new ways to protect things, there are very well-funded organizations out there trying to get around that. So I'm interested in the panel's sort of views on what they think the impact is on businesses and how that sort of feeds into our discussion today. Carl, can I start with you from Pennsylvania? What's the impact on the businesses that you're speaking to of the current username password paradigm?
The impact is tremendous. You know, you really cannot have online banking, digital payments, e-commerce without security, and the security has to be user friendly so people use it, and it has to be trustworthy so people feel comfortable with it, and it has to be instantaneous so that you have convenience. So imagine your example, the person that is about to enter all this personal data on a website to open up a new online account, and they get cold feet and they decide to abandon that shopping cart. Well, what if instead of entering all that information, already behind the scenes was paired the user's name, the user's mobile phone number, the source of funding, could be a credit card, a debit card, a bank account, and the user, using their own memorized PIN, responds to an authentication message to verify a transaction. The user does not need to enter any new information on that website. Everything is paired behind the scenes, and you know it is that user because you can tell they possess their physical handset and only they know the memorized PIN or password. Think about what you've been doing for a lifetime at the ATM window. You walk up with a physical card, what you possess, and a memorized PIN, what you know. But now we need to move to a digital environment. So now we need to make sure it is that physical handset, and we're using a separate secure channel, avoiding the internet and the operating system, and the user's memorized PIN, what you have and what you know, without the need to enter new information on an unknown screen. So the difference could be absolutely phenomenal, because suddenly people are securely transacting and e-commerce is able to flourish.
Great, thanks, Carl. Thanks for that insight. From the Boku perspective, Stuart, what are your customers telling you in terms of the problems, I suppose, you're trying to solve for them?
Yeah, I mean, I think Carl sort of nailed it a bit in that you know, bad experiences are a conversion killer for merchants, particularly, you know, the customers that we serve are the largest kind of digital brands in the world, and for them, you know, the war is happening over subscribers. You know, that's the kind of gold rush, and you know, they use a multitude of tools to try and figure out if, you know, if this is really Stuart that's presenting themselves to my website. And a lot of that, you know, super smart kind of technology, which is, broadly speaking, probabilistic, you know, algorithms, machine learning, device ID kind of stuff, which is great technology. The risk of some of that is, of course, you end up with a whole bunch of false positives. So, you know, if you don't lose the customer because your process is too laborious and complicated, you might lose them in some sort of screening exercise because they look like someone they're not, because of the way that your algorithms are configured. And so what we try and do is add a deterministic kind of layer to that. And again, it's not dissimilar to what Carl described, only a slightly different delivery mechanism, which is at some point you need to kind of touch the real world and find an authoritative source that is deterministic. And in the Boku case, it is, you know, the records that are held on file by the mobile network operator, be it the kind of SIM or information regarding the phone number or the account holder. So it's about saying, we think this is him, but let's just check and make sure. Has anything been tampered with on that phone? Is it the right number we were expecting? And giving some kind of greater degree of confidence that, okay, the name and password were fine, or the email address was fine, but is it really Stuart that we're seeing?
Yeah. Okay. Thanks. Thanks, Stuart. So there's been quite a bit of discussion about mobile and where mobile sits in this. Not unsurprising, you know, given our backgrounds and MEF's focus. But in terms of the mobile network operators' involvement in identity and authentication, you know, it's not been as wholehearted as I think many of us on this call would have liked to have seen. You know, mobile network operators have always been in a really good position to take advantage of this market. They have a trusted billing relationship going back with me over 30 years. You know, and So there's a lot of information that mobile networks can provide to third parties. What's the xConnect view on, I suppose, what Carl and Stuart have talked about, Lee, but also, you know, how what's some of the stuff that you do with network operators and other customers to try and overcome the difficulties that, you know, your customers see?
So I'm kind of very supportive of what kind of Stuart was just saying. So in any process of authentication, whether it's multi-factor, whether it's just passwords, one of the ways that you can mitigate against the risk is to look for environmental factors, whether they be in a mobile network, fixed line, or in the technology that might have changed. If they have changed, that's going to change the way you assess whether there's risk or not. So, you know, xConnect looks for, you know, things like SIM swap, device changes, call forwarding information available, you know, from some mobile operators, not as much as I would like, and then provide those through a, you know, single point of access to, you know, companies like Boku, or, you know, enterprises that need to do these additional checks so they have confidence in the transaction. But I would like to kind of back up a little bit, because I think we are in danger of conflating some issues here. You know, you talked about, you know, abandoned shopping baskets because it's too hard to fill in forms. That's one problem. Authentication is another. I'm slightly uncomfortable with the notion that the internet is not secure. If that were the case, if it were insecure, we would not be doing all of these transactions that we're doing. You know, people buy houses on the internet, you know, with a user ID and a password, right? The issue is, how do you mitigate against the vulnerabilities of the methods that you choose to authenticate? Some of those things will be multi-factor, but whenever you've got a multi-factor authentication, those methods of multi-factor need to be independent, and you have to consider the confidentiality. You know, can someone else intercept it? The integrity, can someone else change it? And availability, can someone take out the whole mechanism? That's entirely the purpose of independent multi-factor authentication. So we have to think about that in anything to do with security.
Okay, thank you, Lee. Thank you for that. So we talked about what the problem is, what the impact is on business, and I think that's, I'll say it's very clear, but, you know, there's a number of different aspects to that. When I worked for O2 several years ago, my job, you know, as head of third-party messaging, was to optimize the balance between ensuring that my customers were safe and secure and weren't being taken advantage of, and obviously allowing our aggregator and content provider partners to make money. So that was my job, to optimize that balance. Sometimes that worked, sometimes unfortunately it didn't, generally due to you know, rather than technical considerations, you know, down to partners sometimes who didn't play ball. But I think the same concept can be applied here. I think that in terms of identity and authentication, it seems as though many of the people that I'm speaking to are looking for that optimal balance between security and user experience, you know, and it seems to me that that's the Holy Grail. That's what everyone's looking for. As Carl said, you know, it needs to be easy, it needs to be simple. You know, if you know, I've got loads of stuff on it, but I still use a Filofax, you know, and I've got passwords and stuff in there. It never leaves the house. But, you know, I'm always in a different part of the house when I cannot remember that password, or I need a bit of information from that. And I suppose the question is, in this search for the optimal sort of balance, where does identity and where does authentication sit? Because as Carl, you know, rightly pointed out, you know, we all have attributes. There are national identity schemes around the world. I know, Carl, you're very familiar with India, the Aadhaar project, which was an amazing project. Yes, it was flawed. Yes, it's been criticised, a great deal, but 1.2, 1.3 billion people, the personal details and biometric scans, including fingerprints and retinal scans, were collected, and that's a huge undertaking. But how necessary is identity to the digital economy? I hope I'm making myself clear here. So it would probably help if you could all give us a bit of a breakdown of your understanding of the difference of identity and authentication and why it's important. Lee, could I ask you to jump in first of all on that?
Yes,
so basically the difference between identity and authentication.
Yeah, if I can manage to come off the mute button. So as I kind of said at the start, identity and access management, how can people identify themselves to a system such that they can do stuff on it and have their access tracked? That's authentication, or identity and access management. I consider digital identity to be the unique characteristics about us which can be digitized and verified by a third party. Now, in English, where we live, what we do, our biometrics, anything about us, any characteristic. So that's the separation. And where are they used? I guess they are critical to prevent fraud. They are critical to avoid, shopping baskets being abandoned, as you said. But with that comes risks. If they're too widely shared, you've got the consequences of data breach, you've got the consequences of identity theft, and you've got the need in a world of compliance to maintain that. Does that help?
Yeah, absolutely, it does. And I think so. Before we move on to the sort of view from Stuart's side, let me explain myself a little bit. Hopefully here. So identity and authentication are, essentially in terms of what we're talking about, in terms of asserting our identity or authenticating that we are the person that we say we are within an online transaction. Should those two things be part of the same overarching framework, or can they coexist, I suppose is what I'm saying. So is it necessary for, is it a good thing potentially for authentication to be part of an overall, for example, national or global identity scheme? Is it, I hope I'm making myself clear here. I suppose what I'm saying is it all part of the same thing, or are we talking about two distinct and separate ecosystems here? Stuart, have you got a view on that?
Yeah, I think you can authenticate yourself without necessarily somebody knowing your full identity.
Yeah.
You can authenticate that you are in possession of a device, and you can authenticate yourself through a thumbprint or a Face ID on a phone, and you've not given away any information about where you live, your age, your date of birth, or any of that sensitive stuff. And so, I think identity is a far more complex thing, and it's undoubtedly the reason why this thing hasn't been solved and there isn't one single solution. I think for me, as a consumer, I just want to know that I can go and interact and prove to people that I am who I say I am without having to hand over a bunch of data every single time. And the question is, who would I trust to store or encrypt or tokenize that imprint of my identity? It might be the government, but frankly, I wouldn't trust them to deliver it. And so, it's highly likely that the people that will deliver this type of solution are the people that have a globally distributed network. And that's going to be the people who are managing the global mobile operating systems, in my humble opinion. but for the time being, I can authenticate, and that seems to be good enough for companies and other parties to make an informed, risk-based decision on whether they think that's me or not. The identity piece, I think, is kind of an emerging thing, and depending on what it is, the definition and the criteria for that might be different. So, passport identity is very different to a, social media identity, for example.
Yeah, great. Thanks, Stuart. And Carl, sorry, I know this is it's quite a big question actually. When you scratch away at it, it's we're talking about massive scale here potentially. What's the Boloro view, Carl?
Sure. So the Boloro view is, and let's take a look at the European regulations as an example, balancing secure customer authentication under something like the Payment Services Directive, the PSD2, with data protection and privacy requirements of GDPR. So the goal would be authenticate yourself, meet the guidelines of secure customer authentication. For example, what do only you possess and what do only you know, without violating your GDPR rights, not being forced to give up personal biometric data or other extremely sensitive information when it's not necessary to authenticate yourself. And I do think that the Europeans are ahead of the curve on the regulatory front, and that we're seeing the rest of the world do exactly that. And, India is a perfect example. I spent a lot of time in India. Boloro is very active there. And the perfect example is, as you mentioned, Ian, the government collected name, Aadhaar number, personal biometric data on everybody. But once that personal biometric data was compromised, how could you ever rely upon it again? And we've seen that it was compromised. But if you have a solution, what Boloro is doing in India, saying we can show that it's your personal mobile handset, and we can show that it's you responding with a memorized PIN or password over a message on a secure channel, even if your personal biometric data has been compromised, we can offer you an authentication solution that sits on top of that. So I think, more and more we're going to see that people want authentication in their own hands. They do not want their personal data to be readily shared and not know who's using it. And I think a proper balance of secure customer authentication and what we see under GDPR is really what's going to be the right answer.
Okay, thank you, Carl. I've got a couple of questions. I've got 2 or 3 questions in actually, but let's I'll park those for a second, if you will. Bear with me, please. The people who've asked those. Moving on to the next question, and I think we've touched on this a bit, but if we could spend the next sort of five plus minutes talking about some of the practical steps, and obviously you'll talk here about your individual company solutions. I would hope that. So, what businesses what steps can businesses take today to optimize their identity and authentication processes? And could we start actually with Stuart, as you're sort of in the middle there from the Boku perspective? What's the advice that you're giving your customers and potential customers?
Yeah, sure. So we're not an all-round identity provider. We're not claiming to be able to give people an identity, but what we do offer is, deterministic, in many cases, signals around either device possession or, has something been compromised on that particular device, has the SIM been swapped, etc. And I think it's a kind of evolving thing. In the short term, it's about adding another layer of certainty to existing fraud prevention routes, for example. So Carl referenced the PSD2 and strong customer authentication. The irony of strong customer authentication is in the short term, it's going to suck in a whole host of additional SMS one-time passcodes into the ecosystem, which are vulnerable and potentially subject to compromise. And so, you've got a piece of regulation doing a back to the future using old technology, which is a password and an SMS message with a 6-digit code in the clear attached to it. So, in a very simple terms, we're gonna help kind of adding some additional checks to see whether that device is indeed in possession of the right hands before a code is issued into the ecosystem. And that just kind of improves what's there today. It doesn't solve the future problem. I certainly think as you fast forward this, I think a lot of the security and identity solutions that will be created will actually be created on the devices or within the operating system itself. And so I think what will happen, and this is just my hypothesis, is that there will be a kind of a bunch of products that are designed to capture data on you and store them securely on your device. And they will be event driven. I'm registering, I've bought a new phone, I've changed my phone, something has happened that is an event. And each time that event happens, there will be a kind of binding of your personal information back to that device. And then in between, what will happen is the parties you're interacting with will call on the token on the device rather than calling out to a whole plethora of third-party services. This is the kind of future state I can see, and I can see that happening, far quicker than any kind of government or globally related identity scheme. I think it will happen, and it will be driven by the global operating systems on the handsets. And we can play a great role in that, because our role will be that kind of touching the real world role, which is, each time an event happens, we'll go and double check that you are still who you say you are, and then that will be again bound back onto your device. So it's all about adding valuable signals that come from a real world source.
Yeah, and obviously the Boku solution around silent authentication is a very elegant response to that, or development from. We've not talked about one-time password here, but thank you for that. Lee, from your side, what steps do businesses need to take today?
So look, I would advocate that if security is an issue for your business, you should be looking at frameworks like ISO 27001. That they will help you assess fully end-to-end where your vulnerabilities are and what you should be doing to mitigate those risks. That's something that xConnect spent the last kind of 18 months doing. It's no small undertaking.
Yeah.
But in terms of a product capability from xConnect, we sing a similar song to what Stuart's saying. We will be out there looking for environmental factors in a mobile network that have changed, that suggests something about your identity has changed, such that an enterprise can change the authentication process if they need to do so. But so in the context that nothing is secure, none of us can present a solution that is secure. It always has vulnerabilities, and if someone says it doesn't, then you should avoid.
Yes, that's a very good point. I think that's one of the opening lines from my white paper, is that if you're looking for 100% security, you're not going to get it, because it doesn't exist in the real world, and we shouldn't expect it to be replicated in digital. But obviously the level of assurance, there is a huge amount that can be done to make things as secure as possible. So Carl, just moving on to yourself, you've touched on some of the work that you guys have done in India, and so what are you telling your prospective customers in terms of what they need to do from the Boloro perspective?
Sure, and one very quick thing I wanted to point out, right now we're all dealing with this pandemic. In addition to online security, nobody wants to touch anything. Nobody wants to touch an ATM keypad. Nobody wants to touch a finger scanner, a point of sale device. There could be public health issues with all of these things. Again, making your personal mobile handset and the security of it that much more crucial. What we're telling people is that with Boloro, we could give you a secure lock and key that is not only multi-factor, but multi-channel, and you don't have to change your underlying app or how your flow works now for your consumer. We layer on top of it. So it's as if, your online experience, your app is your house, and we're coming along with a brand new lock and key to put on it. So at a time when people don't want to have to do a lot of development work, but they want security, we'll hand them the APIs, and we can do everything with them remotely. So we're doing deployments right now remotely via APIs in the same way as we always would. So the fact that we're in a lockdown global pandemic, we're still able to proceed business as usual because it's all API based, all remotely delivered. So that's an extremely important message for us and has allowed us to proceed even during these really tough times.
Great. Thank you, Carl. So I'm a little bit mindful of the time. We're doing very well. We've still got 6 or 7 minutes left of the hour. I wasn't sure we'd use up the whole hour, but it's been a really interesting discussion so far. If we get time to move on to the final discussion point, but I'd like to, we've got a few questions in, and we've got one from Joseph. Let me read this out verbatim. So specifically in the mobile space, who should be responsible for validating identity, and who carries or should carry the liability for it when it goes wrong? And in brackets, and at some point it will. Rather than ask all of you, would someone like to jump in on that if you've got a particular...
Yeah, absolutely. I'm happy to take that. So, I think we've seen through Mobile Connect type services, the ability to use your mobile phone, for example, to authenticate yourself. I cannot see, unless that mobile phone company is also a bank, that they will ever underwrite such a validation, such that if fraud was committed, that mobile operator is not going to indemnify you.
Yeah.
And that means that as an enterprise, you need to take control of authentication yourself and do the sorts of things that, Stuart was advocating, and Carl was advocating. Do some of these out of bound things, but ultimately the enterprise controls the authentication.
Okay, thank you. Let me ask another question, unless anyone's got a burning desire to jump in on that subject. No.
I think I'll just add quickly. You're absolutely right. Ultimately, the bank, for example, would have to take control. Just like the bank manages their ATM pins and passwords, they would do the same thing. The MNO would simply be a connectivity provider.
Yeah.
So I agree completely.
Okay, it's a question of risk there, isn't it? So one from Michael. Let's have a look at, again, I'll do this verbatim. Given that there is still no industry consensus on what identity framework is the best, in inverted commas, and some examples: centralized, decentralized, third-party identity guardians versus SSI. That's help me out, Lee. SSI.
I'm looking at self-sovereign identity. Yeah.
Beg your pardon. As example, what conditions need to come about, governmental or regulatory, etc., for a simpler ecosystem to emerge? So we've not talked much about the role of government and regulation here. I know, Stuart was probably hit the nail on the head there. If we sit around waiting for the government or regulation to find us a way forward, but given that there are such a plethora of solutions across, available to everyone today, what's the way forward, and who's going to set the pace here? And actually, sorry, there's another question underneath that interestingly about Microsoft, and we haven't talked about the big guys in this situation. Microsoft they are supportive of a decentralized approach, utilizing the Bitcoin iteration of blockchain. What do the panelists think about this? Is it controversial? Is it an honest attempt to try and solve the authentication issue, or do they have an ulterior motive in taking some starts? So let's bring those two things together. What needs to happen now?
I haven't been following that particular story, but I kind of think that all of this is a question of capital. If you've got the biggest, deepest pockets, you'll win this market. Last men standing, and we know all those last men are already. It's the Microsofts, the Googles, the Apples. It's a massive problem.
And it is a massive problem. From a I'm sure it's, you know, they're not alone in this, but the feeling, particularly amongst, you know, Europeans, when we used to be Europeans, was that, you know, the idea of the tech giants owning more and more of our particularly personal data and digital identity is a big problem. Carl, have you got a view there? What?
I do. I come back to, you know, some of the things that were in your MEF document earlier. Consumers want security in their own hands, and they do not want the big guys to control all of their personal data. And that's the Boloro message. Put security in people's hands and don't centralize personal data that can be leveraged for purposes it shouldn't be used for. You know, the consumer needs to be in control.
Okay. And Stuart, final word from you.
Yeah, I think as much as we don't like to think that those guys will have the power, I just genuinely believe they will be the first to come up with a meaningful, usable, ubiquitous solution. If you think back to when Apple Pay was launched and we're all walking around in Western Europe with cards, you know, credit and debit cards in our pockets with chips on them, and it was like, what is the purpose of this, and why would the bank sign up to it? And look at it now. It's that kind of trust and convenience that comes with everything that's encapsulated in your device. And I don't think they necessarily want to store the data, but I think this concept of binding your data and creating a trusted token is the way that they will do it. And once the technology is there, they will go and get it endorsed by the relevant regulatory parties to say that it's up to scratch to meet regulatory requirements. And so, you know, it's just a hypothesis, but I do think that is the fastest way that this will happen.
There's a lovely question from Joseph at the end there, which, you know, I don't know the answer for, but it kind of points out that actually it's not just about confidentiality and integrity. You know, it's about availability too. Yeah, what happens when your mobile phone gets broken and lost and you've found all of your digital attributes to that device, and then you need to go and buy something? You know, security is CIA, and we need to get used to that idea.
It just remains for me to thank ever so much our panelists for today. Stuart Neal from Boku, Carl Kilb from Boloro, and Lee Suka from xConnect. Thank you very much, gentlemen. Really interesting discussion. It obviously could have gone on quite a bit longer. That doesn't happen very often during webinars. Thank you very much for your support, and for all MEF members and non-MEF members viewing the webinar today, thank you very much for your participation. If you have any questions that haven't been answered, or anything that you would like to find out more about the personal data and identity working group within MEF, please feel free to contact me directly. My details are on the MEF website. So it just remains for me to wish you all a good morning, good afternoon, good evening, depending on where you are. Please stay safe, and we look forward to seeing you again very soon. Thanks very much.
Thank you. Take care.
Thanks, guys.